Wyoming, 1887. The wind came like a curse today. It hit the plains, and it never asked permission. Eli Mercer rode, and he didn't look back. June, the mare, fought snow and kept breathing. The sky turned iron, and daylight started shrinking fast. His cattle vanished ahead, swallowed by blowing white. He'd counted 43, and he'd counted again. A young rancher, 24, already felt older. Grief had taught him quiet, and quiet felt safer. Then the blizzard arrived, and safety changed meanings. If you're still here, subscribe and ride with me. Real quick, you drinking water today or just coffee? Eli's coat was worn, and his gloves were stiff. His fingers felt wooden, and his wrists ached hard. Snow found every seam and crawled under wool. The wind came sideways and carried grit like sand. It stung his cheeks and it stole his hearing. June lowered her head and pushed through rising drifts. Eli leaned forward and trusted her more than pride. Pride was heavy, and pride didn't warm bones. 3 miles back, his ranch house waited in darkness. 3 miles back, the storm erased all directions. Eli tried south, and the world looked identical. He tried east, and the world stayed blank. White blindness makes a man doubt his own name. He blinked, and ice gathered on his lashes. His beard held frost like a mask of salt. Breath rose, then froze and fell back down. He'd seen storms, but this one moved wrong. Birds disappeared early, and the air turned heavy. Then silence hit, and wind returned as violence. June stumbled once, and Eli caught her neck. He whispered, "Easy, girl," and felt fear spike. Fear isn't loud, it's patient, and it waits. His father's voice returned sharp and familiar inside. "Keep to yourself, son. Trust nobody beyond fences." His mother's voice returned softer and still dangerous. "Keep your heart locked, Tommy. Feeling brings grief." Eli had obeyed them 5 long, empty years. He worked, he ate, he slept and repeated. He didn't drink, he didn't dance, he didn't flirt. Town men called him quiet, then called him worse. Eli let talk pass like wind through wire. Loneliness was cheaper than trusting the wrong soul. But winter doesn't bargain, and winter doesn't care. It takes cattle, it takes men, it takes hopes. Eli saw his herd scatter, then vanish entirely. He cursed once, then swallowed it and rode. The cold climbed inward, past skin, past muscle. It reached his thoughts and made them slow down. That's when mistakes happen, and stories end quietly. June stopped hard, and Eli nearly fell forward. He grabbed her mane and felt her shiver too. A head through whirl and hiss, a glow flickered, a tiny orange like mercy, like a match. Eli stared, and his heart thumped once hard. Fire meant people, and people meant trouble often. Still trouble beats dying alone in white silence. He slid down, and his boots sank deep. He kept June close and stepped toward that glow. Snow shoved his shoulders and pushed him offline. He fought back and lost more ground anyway. Then rock rose, dark a shoulder in storm. Tucked beside it, a lodge stood low, waiting. A teepee shape, tight, smart, built against wind. Eli froze, not from cold, but from memory. He'd never seen one here this far north. His father had stories, and they all ended badly. Smiles first, then knives, that's what he'd said. Eli hated that fear, yet it lived on. The storm howled louder, and he made new math. Pride won't cook, pride won't shelter, pride won't breathe. Eli raised a hand and chose manners over fear. "Hello," he called, and his voice cracked thin. "I'm caught out, I need shelter, I mean none." The hide flap shifted, and firelight spilled outward. 2 women stood there, eyes dark, faces guarded. One looked younger, braid, long posture, calm and ready. One looked older, gaze sharp, hand near her belt. Eli lifted both hands slow, showing empty intent. "My horse is here," he said. "We're lost outside." They spoke low in words Eli couldn't follow. Then the younger one nodded and spoke careful English. "Come in," she said. "Bring horse, tie her there." Relief hit Eli hard and nearly buckled him. He led June around to the lee of rock. His fingers failed, knots and shame rose hot. The older woman stepped close and tied it quick. No scolding words, no glare, just practiced hands working. Eli followed them inside, and heat struck his face. A small fire breathed steady, centered in packed earth. Smoke rose upward through the opening at top. Buffalo robes ringed space, making a warm circle. Eli stood dripping, unsure where to put himself. The younger woman pointed and Eli sat down slow. His legs shook and he finally felt alive. Outside the storm screamed, but inside the fire spoke. Eli realized the night had already changed him, not by romance but by mercy and hard truth. The first rule of winter is simple: accept help. The second rule is harder: remember who gave it. Inside the lodge, heat rolled out and Eli swayed briefly. Smoke drifted upward and the fire sounded like slow applause. Lena watched him, eyes steady, and May stayed near shadows. Eli set his rifle down and kept both palms visible. He'd learned in blizzards that sudden moves invite mistakes quickly. May studied his face, then his hands, then his breathing. Lena pointed by the fire and said, "One word, sit." Eli lowered himself slowly and felt his legs trembling hard. Warmth hit his chest and pain returned in sharp waves. His fingers burned and he welcomed it like proof today. May crouched by a pot and checked water with care. Lena shook snow from robes and hung Eli's coat nearby. Eli tried to thank them, but his teeth kept clacking. Lena nodded once, then said, "Drink this, it helps inside." May handed a cup and the clay warmed Eli's palms. Steam rose bitter and Eli smelled pine mixed with roots. He sipped carefully and the taste punched his throat awake. May watched his wince, then said, "Good, it's working, drink." Eli swallowed again and his eyes watered from strength. Lena sat across shoulders, relaxed, yet her gaze stayed sharp. Eli cleared his throat and forced words through chattering teeth. "I'm Eli Mercer," he said. "I've got land south." Lena replied softly, "I'm Lena, and this is May." Eli blinked at names and his surprise showed too plainly. Lena saw it, then smiled. "Mission school. They renamed us." May added quietly, "Our real names stay safer left unsaid." Eli nodded, embarrassed, and stared at the fire's center. The flames danced low and made beadwork glint on hide. Eli noticed blankets folded and food stored with careful order. This wasn't desperation. It was skill and stubborn survival here. Outside the lodge, wind hammered hard and snow hissed loud. Inside the lodge, time slowed down and breath sounded human. Eli warmed his hands and felt shame rise with comfort. He'd been taught kindness, costs, and debts turn men weak. His father's warnings lingered and sounded like nails in wood. Yet Lena's calm presence made those warnings feel smaller now. May fed the fire and her movements stayed precise always. She didn't fuss, she didn't fear, she simply worked. Eli realized suddenly he'd been cared for without permission. That thought scared him and also steadied him more. He asked softly, "Why help me? I'm not your kin." Lena answered plainly, "Storm doesn't care. Cold kills everyone. Same." May nodded once, then said, "We know hunger. We know loss." Eli held the cup tighter and stared at its rim. He'd expected anger here, yet he'd found discipline and mercy. The tea warmed his belly and his thoughts began moving. Eli tried another question. "Do you live here all winter?" Lena said, "For now we move like seasons decide paths." May added, "Winter came early, we chose this shelter place." Eli heard the word chose and it struck him hard. His own life felt unchosen, like chores chained to grief daily. May watched him thinking, then asked, "You alone, no family nearby?" Eli hesitated, then said, "Just me since fever took them." Lena's eyes softened slightly and she said, "That's heavy carrying." May's voice stayed firm, yet she said, "Alone is dangerous too." Eli nodded and felt the lodge grow quieter around them. He listened to wind and understood how close death had been. Lena poured more tea and pushed the cup toward him. Eli drank again and his hands stopped shaking quite as much. May checked Eli's toes, then said, "Pain means blood, that's good." Eli breathed out slowly and whispered, "Thank you for everything tonight." Lena waved it off, then said, "Eat later. You need heat." May reached for dried meat and offered it without ceremony. Eli took it gently and chewed while watching their faces. He wondered what stories they'd heard about men like him. He wondered what losses had carved those lines around May's eyes. Lena spoke softly, "Our men are gone, taken by soldiers." May's jaw tightened, and she added, "They wanted obedience, not peace." Eli felt his stomach sink, and he couldn't meet May's gaze. He'd heard talk in town, and he'd repeated some himself. Now those words felt dirty and too easy to say. Eli said carefully, I won't bring trouble here, I swear it. May answered, trouble finds everyone, we decide how we face it. Lena leaned forward and asked, what made you ride alone today? Eli swallowed, then said, I tried saving cattle, then lost direction. He admitted, I misjudged the storm and I paid for it. May's expression didn't mock him, and that absence felt surprising. She said, pride kills fast, winter kills faster, learn quick. Eli nodded and felt like a student, not an intruder. Lena asked, your ranch, is it big? Is it lonely there? Eli answered, 300 acres, 43 cattle, and silence always. May tilted her head, then said, silence can be medicine or poison. Eli almost laughed, then stopped because it wasn't funny tonight. He said, I thought silence was peace, but it's colder lately. Lena watched him closely and said, you carry grief like locked iron. Eli flinched at truth and stared back into flames again. May said, your mother's words, they still rule you, don't they? Eli's breath caught, and he asked, how could you know that? Lena answered, we know eyes, we know hands, we know quiet. May added, quiet that's fear sounds different than quiet that's strength. Eli felt exposed, and he hated how relieved he felt too. He admitted, I don't talk much, I don't trust easy anymore. Lena nodded, then said, trust is earned, but it's needed. May stirred the pot and said, tonight you needed, so we acted. Eli asked, aren't you afraid a stranger at your door here? May looked at him, then said, of course, but fear isn't boss. Lena added, we choose what's right, not what's easiest always. Eli held the cup and felt his throat tighten with gratitude. He said, my father taught hate and called it wisdom too. May's eyes narrowed, then she said, many men do that sadly. Lena spoke gently, bad teaching keeps you living half alive, Eli. Eli stared at Lena, and her words landed like warm stones. The fire popped softly and sparks rose, then died in smoke. Outside the lodge, wind still screamed and it sounded hungry. Inside the lodge, Lena's voice stayed calm and May's stayed steady. Eli realized he'd been expecting enemies and found guardians instead. He asked quietly, what do you call this T in your tongue? Lena smiled, then said, it means warmth that walks inside you. May corrected softly, it also means don't freeze, keep breathing now. Eli nodded, and he felt his eyelids growing heavy fast. His body was exhausted and his mind couldn't fight sleep longer. May pointed across the fire and said, sleep there, stay respectful. Eli answered, I will, and he meant it with full heart. Lena placed a robe down and made a space for him. Eli lay back slowly and the buffalo hide cradled him. He stared upward and watched smoke drift through the roof hole. He whispered, I won't forget this. I won't repay with harm. May said quietly, remember with actions, not with pretty words. Tomorrow, Lena added softly, rest now, storm's loud, but you're safe. Eli closed his eyes and felt the fire's warmth hold him. For the first time in years, he didn't sleep alone. He heard two breaths nearby and felt his heart unclench slowly. Outside, winter kept raging, but inside, mercy stayed awake quietly. Eli woke to silence and the lodge felt smaller today. Gray light slipped in, and embers glowed under white ash. His breath came steady, and his hands finally obeyed him. Lena sat near the flap and worked beads without hurry. May was outside, and her steps sounded careful on snow. Eli sat up slowly, and pain tugged through stiff muscles. He remembered the storm and the mercy that beat it. Lena looked over once and nodded like morning was normal. Storm passed, she said, and your horse is safe now. Eli swallowed hard and felt gratitude clog his throat again. I should ride, he said, and check my cattle soon. Lena lifted a bowl and set it near the coals. Eat first, she said, long rides need heat inside. Eli tasted sage and rabbit and something honest in it. May stepped in then and snow-dusted her dark braid. She carried wood easy, and her eyes scanned Eli's face. Eli tried standing, and his knees protested with sharp stiffness. May watched his wobble, and her mouth softened briefly there. Frozen rabbit became nervous deer, Lena teased with gentle pride. Eli almost smiled, and it didn't feel like betrayal. Outside the lodge, sunlight flashed cold across fresh drifts. The world looked scrubbed, clean, and dangerous in its beauty. Eli studied their shelter and admired its smart placement deeply. Rock blocked the wind, and a spring murmured under ice. May pointed at caches and showed traps hidden from wolves. Lena named herbs softly, and her hands moved with certainty. Eli listened close and felt smaller than their knowledge today. "How do you remember?" he asked, and kept his voice respectful. Lena shrugged once and said, "Mothers teach daughters always." May added quietly, "Schools tried stealing that but failed." Eli nodded slowly, and shame rose at Old Town talk. He'd heard men laugh, and he'd never challenged them. Now he saw faces, and those jokes felt poisonous and cheap. May watched him thinking, and her gaze stayed sharp as flint. Then she froze, and her shoulders tightened like drawn wire. Lena followed her stare, and her fingers paused over beads. 3 riders moved distant, and their horses struggled through snow. May said one word, inside, and her tone carried steel. Eli stepped forward and squinted, then recognized a yellow coat. "Ward Harlan rides lead," he said, and relief fought worry. May didn't relax, and she kept her hand near knife. Lena's eyes narrowed, and she watched the riders approach slowly. Eli knew Ward and knew laws ride inside decent men. He also knew Cole Harlan, and knew pride makes boys cruel, and he knew Roof Dobbs and knew hunger for trouble. Eli stepped away from the lodge and met them early. Ward called his name and sounded honestly shaken by fear. "Mercer," he yelled, "we thought you froze dead out there." Eli answered, steady, nearly did, found shelter, still breathing. Ward reined in close, and his eyes moved toward lodge. Cole stared hard, and his grin looked like a bad habit. Roof spat once, and his gaze lingered like a threat. Eli raised a palm and placed himself between worlds calmly. "These women saved me," he said. "I owe my life." Ward studied Eli, and his jaw tightened under frost. Cole chuckled low and said, well, look at this." Roof sneered openly and said, "Ain't they off reservation lines?" Eli kept his voice level and refused to flinch today. "Storm didn't care," he said, "and neither did their kindness." Ward sighed heavy and looked torn between law and decency. "You know I must report," Ward said. "It's the law." Eli felt heat rise, and it wasn't from sun. "You know what happens to women hauled back alone," Eli said. Ward blinked once and didn't answer because truth hurts quickly. Cole laughed ugly and tried to cut Eli with insults. "Since when you care," Cole said, "we thought you hated women." Roof leaned forward, and his hand drifted toward rifle stock. May stepped to the flap, and her eyes warned without words. Lena stood beside May, and her posture stayed calm, ready. Eli noticed their stillness, and it steadied his shaking heart. "Move along," Eli said. "You saw snow, nothing else." Ward stared at Eli and weighed consequences in silence there. "This ain't like you," Ward said. "What changed you, son?" Eli answered simply, "Decency changed me, and I won't betray." Roof snorted and muttered something mean under his breath again. Eli didn't reach for steel, and that restraint took strength. Ward lifted his hand and signaled the others to ease. "Hell," Ward said louder. "I didn't see nothing out here." Cole's jaw clenched tight, and he looked back at Lodge. Roof glared long, and Eli felt that gaze promised trouble. Ward turned his horse and spoke without looking back now. "Be careful, son," he said. "This can go bad." Eli watched them leave, and his hands began shaking again, not from cold but from choosing a side at last. May stepped closer and asked one question. "Why risk for us?" Eli swallowed hard and looked at Lena's steady eyes. "Because it's right," he said, "and because you trusted me." Lena's smile returned softly, and it warmed him more than fire. May studied Eli long and finally nodded once accepting him. Eli exhaled slow and felt walls inside him crack wider. He realized courage isn't loud, it's a quiet decision daily. The wind stayed cold, but it no longer sounded lonely. Eli looked south and knew his ranch would feel different. He touched June's reins and promised himself, "I won't hide." Lena watched him mount, and her gaze held cautious hope. May stood beside her, and the two looked unbroken together. Eli raised his hand and left, with his heart awake. 3 days passed, and Eli couldn't stop hearing the wind. Not the storm wind, but the quiet wind that lives in memory. He sat at his rough table, coffee cooling in his hands. The ranch house was the same wood, the same walls, the same silence. Yet now the silence felt like an accusation, not peace. He walked outside, checked fences, checked troughs, checked himself. 4 cattle lay frozen in the north pasture, stiff as posts. He stared at them a long time and felt nothing at first. That scared him more than grief, because numbness is its own death. Then, like a delayed bullet, the feeling hit somewhere deeper. Not for the cattle, but for the warmth he'd tasted. Warmth that wasn't a stove and wasn't whiskey and wasn't pride. Warmth that came from two women who owed him nothing. Eli caught himself looking north like a man watching for sunrise. He muttered once, "What's wrong with you, Mercer? Get to work." Work didn't answer, because work never answers lonely men. That afternoon he loaded his pack with supplies: flour, salt, coffee, a chunk of venison from a deer he'd taken at dawn. He added 2 blankets, not sure why, just knowing he should. At the last moment he held a small sack of sugar. Sugar was a luxury, and he hated luxuries on principle. He also remembered Lena's bitter tea and her steady eyes. He tossed the sugar in anyway, and felt foolish relief. June took the trail with ears forward like she remembered. Eli rode slow at first, scanning ridges for riders. Then he rode faster, because fear can look like impatience. When the rock outcrop came into view, his throat tightened. The lodge was still there, low and smart against the wind. Relief hit him so hard he nearly laughed out loud. Lena stepped out as he approached like she'd been watching. May appeared behind her, carrying a rabbit gaze, measuring. Eli dismounted suddenly, awkward, like a boy at a church door. "I said I'd come back," he blurted, and hated himself for rushing. Lena nodded once and said, "You came back, that matters." May looked at the pack, then at Eli, expression unreadable. "You risk much," she said, "coming here again." Eli answered, "You risked more letting me in." May's eyes held him, then she looked away first. They unloaded supplies without celebration, just practical motions. May's fingers lingered on the blankets, and she didn't hide need. Lena lifted the sugar, eyes widening like she'd found gold. Eli tried to shrug it off, but his ears burned. "Stay," Lena said. "Eat with us, then ride." Eli knew he should refuse, and his feet didn't move. He stayed because the ranch house felt like a tomb now. They ate in firelight, and the talk came easier than before. Eli told them about calving season, about coyotes, about drought. May asked sharp questions that proved she knew horses well. Lena listened, like every detail meant something to her. Eli realized he was talking, truly talking, without guarding every word. Weeks turned into a pattern, quiet as snowfall. Eli found reasons to ride north 3 times a week, sometimes 4 when excuses felt thinner and he didn't care. He varied his routes, learned to cross gullies without leaving prints. May taught him how to read wind and how to spot watchers. Lena taught him herbs and names and patience that held steel. Eli learned their real names in whispers, then agreed to hide them. Some names, Lena said, are better kept safe from mouths like knives. May told him she'd once been married to a warrior. She said it plain, but grief sat behind her eyes. Lena said she'd been promised to a man she never met. Then Sand Creek happened, and the promise turned to ash. Eli didn't ask details, because some wounds don't need questions. He offered silence, and they offered trust, and it was enough. Eli also changed in ways he didn't recognize. He hummed while mending fence, and the sound startled him. Food tasted stronger. Sunrise looked wider. Even cold felt less personal, like it wasn't only for him. One afternoon he arrived and found Lena alone by the fire. May had gone to check trap lines, leaving a rare pocket of privacy. Lena sat close enough that Eli could smell sage smoke in her hair. She watched him with that quiet gaze that saw too much. "You different now," she said, less like scared rabbit, more like man. Eli tried joking, nervous deer maybe, and his voice cracked. Lena didn't laugh this time. She reached out and touched his hand. The touch was light, but it hit him like thunder. Eli froze because he'd never held a woman's hand before. Not in comfort, not in promise, not in anything that mattered. He turned his palm up, gently catching her fingers. They sat like that fire-popping silence, breathing between them. Eli felt his heart pound, and he hated how exposed it felt. He whispered, "I don't know what I'm doing." Lena answered softly, "Some men touch many and never feel. You feel first, that's better way." Eli swallowed hard and admitted the deeper truth. "Everything I was taught says this is wrong," he said. Lena squeezed his hand once. "Good teaching helps us live," she said. "Bad teaching keeps us from living. Which one was yours?" May returned, then boots crunching snow outside. Lena withdrew her hand without shame like it belonged to both. May looked once at their faces and knew. She didn't scold, she didn't tease. She only said, "Be careful," not because love is shame, but because love brings hunters. That night, riding home under stars sharp as broken glass, Eli said the sentence he'd been avoiding for weeks. "I'm falling for her," he admitted to the dark. June flicked an ear and kept walking like she accepted it. Eli stared at his own ranch lights in the distance. They used to look like safety. Now they looked like half a life waiting for the rest. The next morning, Eli went to town for supplies. He bought coffee, tea, ammunition nails, and a small mirror. The mirror had a carved handle and it cost too much. Old man Tully behind the counter raised an eyebrow. "Got yourself a sweetheart, Mercer," he said. Eli mumbled something face hot and hurried outside. The word sweetheart felt strange and wonderful and dangerous. When he brought the mirror to Lena, her eyes lit up. She turned it in the firelight, catching her own reflection slowly. "No one gave me gift like this," she whispered. "Not because they had to, but because they wanted to." Eli shrugged, embarrassed. "It's nothing," he said, and he knew it wasn't. May watched from across the fire and her mouth curved. "Nervous deer becomes brave deer," she said. Eli laughed, once real and rusty, and Lena smiled with him. For the first time in 5 years, the future didn't look fixed. It looked risky and alive, and worth losing sleep over. Cedar Falls smelled of whiskey, wet wool, and talk that stuck to a man's boots all day long. Eli sat in the darkest corner holding a glass he didn't want, wearing calm like a disguise today. He'd come for nails and coffee, but Tully's store was closed, so the saloon waited for him alone. Men laughed near the bar, and their laughter sounded easy, the way cruelty often starts on cold nights. Eli kept his hat low because eyes notice a quiet man, and questions follow eyes straight to trouble. A rancher named Cutler bragged about fences, then lowered his voice, chasing a fresher rumor from the north. He said he'd seen smoke lines thin as hair near Mercer Country just before last dusk out there. Another man answered, "Apaches don't stay quiet, and the army's coming to sweep next week, so they say." Eli's fingers tightened, then loosened, because fear can't show on your face in a saloon full of wolves. Cole Harlan leaned back, smiling like a boy with matches, and he aimed his words at Eli alone. He said the hermit rancher finally found company, and the company wasn't fit for church daylight in town. Roof Dobbs laughed too, a dry scrape, and Eli felt that sound like a spur on skin again. Ward Harlan tried slowing it down, saying Mercer keeps to himself, and that's his right under open sky. Cole snorted, then said rights end when a man hides renegades, and everybody knows it in this county. Eli took one slow sip, tasting nothing, and he counted his breaths like he counted bullets at dusk. He remembered Lena's steady eyes and May's warning, and he kept his jaw from tightening in plain sight. He waited until talk shifted to cattle prices. Then he stood casual and walked toward the door slowly. Outside, the cold slapped him awake, and he mounted June with hands that refused to shake just yet. He rode easy past the last storefront, then drove her hard once the town couldn't see him anymore. Snow still lay in pockets, but spring sun had sharpened edges, and that made tracks easier to read. Eli took the longer route, crossing a shallow creek, circling cottonwoods, and watching ridgelines for riders behind him. When the hidden valley opened, Lena was at the stream, and May was repairing their lean shelter quietly. Lena's smile faded the moment she saw his face, because bad news changes the air fast out here. Eli told them about the saloon talk, the sweep, and Cole's hints without dressing it up one bit. May's eyes hardened, and she said Roof won't wait for soldiers, he'll bring men like him for sport. Eli said you must move tonight west or north because paper law will not listen to mercy ever. Lena lifted her chin and her voice stayed calm, saying, "We run no more. We're tired of smoke." Eli felt anger, flare, then guilt, because he loved them, and fear kept shouting inside him all day. May asked survive for what, and Eli heard his own years of silence answering that question too loudly. Lena stepped closer, water on her hands, and said, "You live dead inside. Remember that before you preach." Eli dropped his gaze because she was right, and rightness can feel like a knife in soft ribs. He asked what other option exists, and May answered with a small smile, "Friends already exist nearby too." Eli blinked because he'd thought secrecy was perfect, and that thought now looked foolish under this wide sun. May said. Ruth Calder found their tracks came herself and promised she'd bury hate first before children did. Lena said Mrs. Chen knows too, and Jorge knows, and those people know exclusion well from hard years. Eli asked how many, and May said, enough. Not many, but enough to matter when trouble shows teeth. Silence settled, and Eli understood the real choice wasn't flight, it was whether he'd stand with them now. He said, I'll stand, but I'm scared because losing you would end what I just found at last. Lena took his hands and said, fear is wise, but fear that stops living is poison for men. May nodded once, then laid out positions in the valley and routes through rocks for escape if needed. Eli promised to keep routines normal, be seen in town, and deny smoke if asked with steady eyes. They worked until evening, moving stones, checking sight lines, and choosing places where one rifle could speak for all. When dusk came, Eli had to leave, but Lena walked him out, and May watched the ridge still. Lena said the town will sniff around, and Eli said let them, words don't break bones most times. May answered sometimes words break spirits, and Eli swallowed because he knew that truth too from his youth. Eli mounted June, and the valley felt like a home he hadn't earned yet, couldn't abandon anymore now. He rode back under stars, and the sky looked wider, because responsibility makes heaven feel close at night. At his ranch, he cleaned his rifle, counted cartridges, and tried to think like May thinks in rocks. He didn't want killing. He wanted deterrence, and he wanted time, because time is mercy for brave hearts. Before sleep, he whispered to the empty room, I'm sorry, Ma, I'm unlocking the door you nailed shut. Morning brought Ruth Calder again, bread in a basket, and a look that said, we moved today fast. She told Eli the rumor campaign worked because a patrol rode west chasing smoke that never existed anywhere. Eli felt relief then. May's warning returned, and he knew Dobbs might strike before uniforms arrive at all. Ruth said Jorge's men will spread word, and Mrs. Chen's boy will watch the livery stable every dusk. She said, Ward Harlan is torn, but he's not blind, and a father can still choose right later. Eli rode to the valley with these updates, and Lena listened, then smiled like dawn breaking through clouds. May didn't smile, but she adjusted traps, and that was her version of hope showing itself to Eli. That afternoon they practiced signals, a hawk call, a stone pile, and a ribbon tied low on pine. Eli learned that defense begins with attention, and attention begins with admitting you're not alone in your fear. He also learned that love is loud even when it's quiet because it changes your posture in public. On the third night, Lena asked if Eli regrets it, and he answered no, not anymore, not ever. May warned, the first blow comes from men who feel shamed, and shame makes them reckless in groups. Eli remembered Cole's grin, and he pictured Dobbs gathering riders, calling it duty, calling it cleansing for town. He asked May how many could come, and she said, enough, because cowards multiply when unchecked by law. Lena touched Eli's sleeve and said, promise you'll think, not charge, if shooting starts at dawn in Valley. Eli promised, and he meant it because he'd finally learned pride isn't the same as courage out here. Before he left, Lena pressed sugar into his palm and said, bring this back after we win together. Eli laughed once, then realized she was serious because planning sweetness means planning survival too in hard times. He rode home, and the ranch didn't feel empty because the valley sat inside his chest like fire. In town the next day, Eli made himself visible, buying feed, nodding once, refusing to hurry past men. Cole watched from the porch, and Eli met his eyes, letting calm say, I'm not afraid of you. Ruth Dobbs wasn't there, and that absence felt worse because absent wolves are hunting somewhere in daylight too. That evening, a rider passed Eli's fence without waving, and Eli knew the message was deliberate for him. He saddled June after dark because waiting is how mobs win, and he needed May's counsel right now. As he rode, he heard the plains whisper, and he understood the next sunrise would test them all. Ruth Calder rode in at dawn, bread on her saddle, eyes sharp enough to cut excuses today too. Eli welcomed her inside, coffee steaming, and she spoke first, because danger doesn't wait for politeness, ever alone. She said Dobbs would strike before uniforms arrived, and Eli believed her because cruelty hates competition always. Ruth spread a rough map on the table and tapped westward where gossip could be planted easily. Jorge would start it at the livery, and Mrs. Chen would echo it through quiet family channels. Eli asked why they'd risk it, and Ruth answered because some wars follow you, even west. She spoke of her buried son, and her jaw tightened because grief can become a compass too. Eli listened with respect, and he felt smaller because he'd mistaken isolation for strength for years. Ruth said the trick was misdirection. Wave one hand with smoke talk and hide truth elsewhere. Eli nodded, then saddled June and rode to the valley carrying plans like fragile glass. Lena met him by the spring, and May watched ridgelines because watching is prayer in hard country. Eli told them about Ruth and the rumor plan, and May's eyes narrowed with approval. May said, "A valley can defend itself, but only if every escape route is remembered in darkness." Lena asked about Ward Harlan, and Eli admitted Ward was torn but not blind yet. May replied that torn men can still choose, and chosen men can still fail, so prepare anyway. They spent the afternoon moving stones and marking cover, and checking where rifles could speak safely. Eli learned to stop walking skylines, and May corrected him because silhouettes invite bullets from cowards. Lena showed him signals made from small things, a ribbon on pine, a stacked stone by water. Eli practiced the hawk call, and they laughed once because even fear needs a breath of light. At dusk, Eli rode home slow and kept normal routes because visibility can be armor sometimes. He stopped in town next morning buying nails and feed, and he let men see him calm. Cole Harlan watched from a porch, and Eli met his eyes because backing down invites pursuit, always. Roof Dobbs was absent, and absence felt worse because wolves hunt best when unseen in daylight. Eli returned to Ruth's place, and she handed him a note written for Josiah Pike. She said the lawyer might help later, and Eli thanked her, though he hoped he wouldn't. That night, Mrs. Chen's son David rode by Eli's barn and spoke softly, quick and careful. He said men were gathering and whiskey was flowing, and Dobbs promised a cleansing ride soon. Eli felt cold climb his spine, and he asked when, and David said, "Maybe dawn." Eli saddled June without lantern light, and he rode out because warning matters more than sleep. The valley greeted him with quiet, and May's voice came from shadow saying, "You heard it too." Eli told him what David said, and May nodded once because she'd expected this turn. Lena touched Eli's sleeve and asked if he regretted anything, and he answered not her. May said regret wastes time, and time is blood, so they planned with blunt honesty now. They chose positions for defenders, and they chose fallback routes, and they chose silence as discipline. Eli asked how many allies would come, and May said, "Only those who can arrive unseen." Lena said Ruth would come anyway, and May sighed because brave elders are harder to stop. Eli offered to warn Ward Harlan, and May questioned that because sons can twist a father's tongue. Lena said Ward still had decency, and Eli agreed, but he promised not to rely on it. They built a low fire in a cave mouth and kept smoke thin because smoke is gossip. May practiced moving between rocks, and Eli followed, learning how land can swallow a person quickly. Lena sorted herbs into small bundles, and Eli asked why, and she said pain steals focus. May checked rifles and checked spare rounds, and she warned Eli shoot only when necessary. Eli swallowed and said he didn't want killing, and May answered, "Then make fear do work." Lena reminded him to breathe, and she held his hand once because steadiness travels through touch. Eli felt his heart hammer, and he hated the feeling, yet he knew it meant living. Before midnight, Ruth arrived with two shapes behind her, Jorge's vaqueros, quiet men with calm faces. Ruth dismounted slowly and spoke low, saying, "Rumor took the patrol west buying precious days." Eli felt relief then. May corrected him because relief can make a man careless too quickly. Ruth said Dobbs didn't care about patrols, he wanted a spectacle, and she spat into dust. Jorge's men checked the valley mouth and nodded because the entrance was a trap for fools. David Chen arrived next and handed Eli a folded note, listing names and times and threats. He said Dobbs promised 10 riders and Cole would follow, and Eli's stomach tightened hard again. May asked where Ward Harlan was, and David said Ward stayed home but argued with Cole. Ruth muttered that fathers learn late, and she told Eli, "Don't expect a miracle from pride." Eli nodded, and he confessed fear, and Ruth replied, "Fear is fine, but running is poison." Lena looked at Eli, and her gaze said, "Choose us, choose life, choose the hard road." Eli answered with his posture standing taller, and he felt the old lonely man fall away. May placed Eli near a rock shelf, giving cover, and she warned him, "Don't chase glory. Ruth took a position behind brush, and Jorge's men watched flanks, because mobs love side paths. They waited through long hours, hearing owls call, and listening for hooves, and counting heartbeats quietly. Just before dawn, May signaled, and Eli heard it, a soft hawk call, sharp and final. Riders appeared at the valley, mouth dark shapes against pale snow, moving too fast for mercy. Eli recognized Dobbs by posture, and he recognized Cole by youthful swagger and his jaw set. Lena stepped beside Eli, rifle ready, and she whispered, "Remember your promise. Think before you act." Eli nodded once, and he felt Ruth's presence behind him like a steady hand on conscience. May vanished into high ground, and Eli knew she was the valley's teeth waiting to bite. Dobbs shouted into the cold, and his voice carried hate, calling it duty, calling it cleansing. Eli lifted his rifle without aiming, and he stepped forward, because courage begins with being seen. The valley held its breath, and the first moment of violence hovered balanced on one bad twitch. Dobbs rode first, because cowards love leading when they believe the ending is easy. Cole Harlan rode beside him, chin-high eyes, bright with borrowed courage and loud town talk. Behind them came 8 more, loose, noisy, and hungry for a story they could brag about later. Their horses shoved through snow crust, and the valley mouth swallowed the sound like a throat. Eli stood where they could see him, rifle held low, not aimed because he wanted words first. Lena stood at his shoulder, calm as stone, and May was gone into high ground already. Ruth Calder waited behind brush with Jorge's 2 vaqueros, and David Chen watched the flank. Eli felt his heart thumping, and he didn't let it climb into his face. Dobbs lifted his voice and threw hate like a rope. "Mercer," he shouted, "we know you're hiding them. Women, come out and answer." Cole laughed, and the laugh sounded young, cruel, and desperate to be noticed. Eli answered plain, "This is private land. You're trespassing. Turn around now." Dobbs spat and said, "Open range don't belong to a traitor." He said, "The town is tired, and the town wants the valley cleaned." Eli heard the word cleaned, and he understood the kind of men he faced. Men who call cruelty hygiene because it helps them sleep. He kept his tone steady, because steady makes angry men feel smaller. "Funny how brave you are with 10 behind you," Eli called. "Where's Ward Harlan? Cole, does your father know you're here today?" Cole's jaw tightened, and his eyes flickered, because fathers still matter to boys. Dobbs shoved his horse forward, and he took the question like an insult. "Old man Harlan's gone soft," Dobbs yelled, "but we ain't. We're ending this now before soldiers come, and do it slow." Lena's hand touched Eli's sleeve, once a quiet reminder to breathe. Eli nodded slightly, and he raised his voice again. "You want to fight," Eli said, "or you want an excuse to hurt women?" Dobbs laughed, and his men laughed with him, because mobs borrow one throat. Then a rifle cracked from above, sharp as a nail driven into wood. Dobbs's hat flew off spinning, and snow puffed where the bullet kissed rock. May's voice carried down cold and clean. "Next one won't miss," she said. "You're in our rocks now." The riders shifted suddenly, aware the valley had teeth. Their horses danced, and the men pulled reins like panic could be controlled. One rider shouted, "You shoot us, it's murder. We'll have the law on you." Eli answered, "Self-defense ain't murder, and you know it in your bones." Another voice rose behind the mob, and it made the riders twist around fast. Ruth Calder rode into view, small woman, straight back eyes like flint. She looked at Dobbs, and her voice was louder than his hate. "You boys done playing heroes," Ruth called, "because you look like thieves to me." Dobbs snarled. "Old woman, go home. This ain't your business," Ruth replied. "It became my business when cowards started hunting girls for sport." Jorge's vaqueros came in behind her, calm, ready, and quiet. David Chen stayed on the edge watching hands, because hands start wars first. Dobbs's men glanced at each other, because unexpected witnesses make courage leak out. Cole lifted his chin again, trying to rebuild swagger. "Ruth," he called, "you don't know what you're protecting." Ruth smiled without warmth. "I know exactly," she said. "I'm protecting decency from boys who lost it." Eli felt the tension rise, then stretch like rope about to snap. He watched Dobbs calculate, because Dobbs wanted advantage, not fairness. Then hoofbeats came from behind the mob, heavy and urgent. A rider pushed through, and Eli recognized Ward Harlan by his shoulders. Ward's face looked carved from tired weather, and his eyes went straight to Cole. "What in God's name are you doing?" Ward shouted. Cole's voice cracked. "Pa, they're harboring renegades. It's the law." Ward swung down and his boots hit snow like a verdict. He faced Dobbs first and his jaw clenched. Ruth, Ward said, "You're not a deputy, you're not a marshal, you're a hired hand." Dobbs sneered, "We're doing what men ought to do, cleaning out trouble." Ward turned on him, and the air shifted. "The only trouble is what you brought," Ward said, "and you know it." Cole stared at his father, anger and fear wrestling on his face. "You, taking their side," Cole snapped, "against your own kind." Ward's eyes hardened, and his voice came out low and dangerous. "My kind is decent folks trying to live in peace," Ward said. "And my son is standing in a mob threatening women like a coward." Cole flinched because truth from your father hits harder than any fist. Dobbs looked around and he saw the odds changing. May held high ground. Eli stood steady. Ruth had witnesses. Vaqueros watched flanks. And now Ward stood between Cole and disgrace. Dobbs hated that because he needed the crowd to feel righteous. One of Dobbs's riders made a mistake then, the kind that ruins plans. He reached for his pistol thinking he could force fear back into the valley. A second rifle crack came from above, and the man yelped, clutching his shoulder. His pistol flew into snow and his horse jerked sideways, spooked by pain. May's shot wasn't to kill, it was to teach. It said, "We're not prey and we're not alone." The mob's noise faltered and silence started eating their courage fast. Ward lifted his voice and it rolled through the mouth like thunder. "Enough," Ward shouted. "Dobbs, collect your man and get out of here now. Cole, you're coming with me and you're going to look at yourself after." Dobbs's face twisted and he pointed at Eli with hate. "This ain't over, Mercer," he hissed. "You chose your side." Eli answered quiet, and that quiet made it worse for Dobbs. "I did," Eli said, "and you chose yours a long time ago. Now leave, before you force the law to notice what you are." Dobbs spat, then yanked his reins because losing in public feels like choking. His men followed fast, some pretending they never wanted this anyway. The wounded rider got hauled along groaning, and the mob's courage broke apart. Cole stayed a second longer staring at Lena, and the valley like it betrayed him. Ward grabbed Cole's bridle, and Cole finally looked away, ashamed and furious at once. As they rode out, Ward glanced back at Eli, eyes tired, honest. "Be careful, son," Ward called, "because this kind of stand costs later." Then the valley quiet returned, and Eli realized his hands were shaking again. Not from cold, but from the weight of what just happened. Lena slipped her hand into his warm and steady. "You see," she whispered, "not alone, not anymore." May climbed down from rock eyes, scanning the mouth for riders returning. "They'll come back someday," May said, "but not today. Cowards need easy wins." Ruth rode closer, and she looked at Lena with something like respect. "Eat," Ruth said, handing a basket forward. "You girls need strength now." Jorge's men tipped their hats, quiet, respectful, then faded back out. David Chen nodded once at Eli, then rode away because watchers stay moving. Eli looked at the rocks and the snow and the faces beside him. He understood the line had been drawn and it wouldn't erase easy. Yet he also understood something better than fear. A community had spoken and it sounded stronger than hate today. 2 days after the mob fled, Eli found an official letter nailed to his door with stiff authority inside today. It said, an Indian agent was coming with an escort to investigate rumors and to make an example soon. Eli read it twice, then a third time, because paper can feel heavier than rifles when it's aimed. He saddled June fast, rode north hard, and kept his eyes off town roads because watchers multiply quickly. When he reached the valley, May and Lena were already packing, moving quiet like they'd heard wind gossip. Eli jumped down and said, "No, we're not running. Not again, because running teaches hate to chase." May held a rolled blanket, and her eyes asked what plan beats paper guns and men who obey. Eli pulled another letter worn from handling and said, "Ruth found a lawyer who sees a crack." Lena took it gently, read slow, and her brows rose because the idea sounded strange yet possible. Eli explained adoption papers a legal shield, making them family so the agent can't haul them easily. May's jaw tightened because claiming kin in public can cut deeper than a bullet in small towns. Lena looked at Eli and asked, "You'd name us family where every mouth can spit on you." Eli answered, "I already do, and this only forces the law to see what it tries ignoring." May said, "People will punish you with closed doors, bad prices, and threats at night, not only talk." Eli nodded and said, "I know, but I've seen enough good souls to keep us breathing. Lena touched May's shoulder and said we choose life even if life comes wearing foolish paperwork today. May stared at the valley mouth, then said fine, but we do it smart and we keep exits. They packed light because freedom travels better without heavy things, and they hid traces before leaving. Eli rode ahead checking roads, and he avoided Cedar Falls until dusk because gossip runs on sunlight. Ruth Calder met them outside town, calm on her horse, and she carried a basket like armor. She said the lawyer is ready and the judge can't refuse if the papers are written right. Lena asked why Ruth cares so much, and Ruth said, because hate buried my boy and I'm done. May didn't smile, but she respected that answer because grief is a language every hard land speaks. They entered Cedar Falls at morning heads up because hiding invites hunters and hunters love bowed necks. Men on porches watched and women whispered, and Eli heard his name stretched into ugly shapes again. Eli kept walking because walking steady is how you deny cowards their favorite sport, flinching. Josiah Pike waited by the courthouse, younger than Eli expected, with sharp eyes and careful hands. He greeted them polite, then said, "This is irregular, but the law is silent, and silence helps." Inside the courtroom smelled of ink, sweat, and reluctance, because small towns hate new ideas. Judge Farwell sat stiff, and he looked like a man swallowing nails while trying to keep manners. He studied May and Lena, then Eli, then Pike, and he asked if Eli understood responsibility fully. Eli said, "Yes, Your Honor," and he didn't blink, because blinking is a surrender in rooms like this. The judge asked May and Lena if they consented, and they answered together, "We consent," clear and calm. A clerk wrote fast, the pen scratching like a small animal trying to escape, and the room listened. Judge Farwell signed reluctant, then muttered, "May God have mercy," because he feared consequences more than sin. Outside, a crowd gathered hungry for scandal, and Eli felt their eyes like stones thrown slow. Some men spat, some women frowned, and a few faces softened because decency still lives even here. Ruth raised her voice and said, "I'm baking a cake. Not every day a man gains sisters." A nervous laugh moved through the crowd, and laughter broke tension the way rain breaks dust. Eli led May and Lena away, and he heard names hissed behind him, but he didn't turn. At the ranch that evening, another visitor waited, Reverend O'Rourke, Bible-worn, eyes bright with stubborn faith. He tipped his hat and said, "I heard vows might need speaking before fear steals the chance." Eli looked at Lena surprised, and Lena smiled, saying Jorge sent word because community travels faster than hate. May crossed her arms and said, "If we speak vows, we do it with witnesses and with daylight." Reverend O'Rourke nodded and said, "Faith that hides becomes shame, and love deserves a clear sky." They rode back to the valley at sunset because the valley had already tested them and held. Ruth arrived first with her husband, and Jorge came with his wife and 2 quiet vaqueros. David Chen came too, standing close, eyes alert, because danger doesn't respect ceremonies or prayers. Ward Harlan showed up late, shoulders heavy, and he avoided Cole's name like it burned his tongue. The sky turned amber and wind softened as if the plains were listening and considering mercy. Lena wore her mother's dress, beadwork catching light, and Eli felt his chest tighten with awe. May stood beside her, fierce and protective like a boundary line no coward could cross freely. Reverend O'Rourke spoke plain, saying, "Love is a hard road and hate is easy rot." He asked Eli if he'd take Lena, choosing love over ease, knowing the cost. Eli said I'd do, voice steady, because he'd practiced courage every day since the blizzard night. The Reverend asked Lena if she'd take Eli, bringing strength to his fear and patience to his learning. Lena said I do, and her eyes shone because choosing is a kind of freedom too. Reverend O'Rourke declared them married in heaven's eyes, if not the territory's laws, and everyone breathed. Eli kissed Lena, careful and real, and Ruth cheered like she was chasing ghosts out. May smiled once, small and fierce, because she'd feared losing Lena, and now she saw a future. They ate simple food, shared stories, and listened to Jorge's quiet guitar while watchers kept the ridges. Eli held Lena's hand and felt how natural it had become, this warmth that once terrified him. May kept her rifle nearby because joy without vigilance is how mobs return with louder lies. 3 weeks later, the agent arrived, Marcus Pemberton, thin and nervous, with soldiers who looked bored. He carried forms and he carried contempt, and he spoke like procedure. Was holiness and mercy was weakness. Pemberton demanded to see the women, and Eli stepped forward, saying, "They're family, and you'll speak decent." Pike stood beside Eli, calm and sharp, and handed papers like a blade wrapped in cloth. Pemberton read frowning, then said, "This is irregular," and Pike replied, "Irregular is not illegal, sir." Pemberton tried intimidation, hinting at prison, debt, and violence, but his words landed softer this time, because behind Eli stood Ruth and Jorge and David and Ward and a few more quiet faces. The agent noticed them, and his confidence wavered, because bullies hate witnesses who won't look away. He snapped that the women belong on a reservation, and Lena answered, "We belong where we choose." Pemberton scoffed, then asked Eli if he's betting his adopted sister trying to poison the room. Eli didn't flinch and said, "Lena is my wife, and your paperwork doesn't define my vows." Pike added that adoption and marriage sit in different boxes, and the law lacks language to forbid. Pemberton searched for a hook, but the hook wasn't there, and the judge's signature held firm. He warned of consequences later because men like him never admit defeat, they only postpone cruelty. Then he left Boots angry on Dirt escort following, and the ranch breathed again in relief. That night Eli sat at his table, coffee cooling, and he listened to voices in the house. Not the wind alone, but Lena humming softly and May moving tools and life sounding ordinary. Eli realized ordinary is the miracle because ordinary means you survived and you're building something lasting. Lena asked, was it worth losing easy friends and easy trade and easy quiet in town? Eli looked at her, then at May, and he said, "Worth everything because I'm alive inside now." May nodded and said, "The fight isn't finished, but we've proven we can stand and not break." Ruth's cake arrived the next day, and the sweetness tasted like defiance and like community and crumbs. Some doors in town stayed closed, but others opened and opened wide because courage invites courage. Ward Harlan began speaking to Eli again, careful, ashamed, but trying because fathers can learn late. Cole stayed bitter, yet bitter men tire when the world refuses, giving them a stage forever. Eli and Lena worked the ranch, and May helped with horses, and their days gained rhythm and meaning. They watched the ridges and they kept roots, and they never forgot how fast hate can gather. But they also planted a small garden because planting says tomorrow matters and tomorrow is worth risk. When Eli stood at sunrise, he didn't feel trapped by his land, he felt rooted in it. He remembered the blizzard, the lodge, the first cup of bitter tea, and the first mercy offered. He understood his mother's warning had love, but fear had twisted it into a cage for him. Now his lesson was different, and he'd say it plain, for anyone listening, beyond these hills. A life lived hiding from loss is still a life being stolen, just slower and quieter each year. So tell me, friend, would you trade easy approval for one hard love that finally teaches you living?